to talk about this a little bit more and see exactly where we stand. I'm going to cross over, talk to political commentator and analyst, Mr. Jason Unruhe, about all this. Thanks so much for being with us. Your Mick, first of all, let's start on this latest weapons test by the North Koreans. Why do you think they did it at this time?
I think they did it at this time because, not that there's any significant date to it, but I think the fact they've been going full steam ahead with all of their capabilities. They realize now that, especially with information that's been leaked from the White House, that there really is no military solution to the quote-unquote North Korea problem without some kind of event resulting in the deaths of millions of people. The DPRK now knows that they have the most severe deterrent against invasion possible, and now they can go ahead and develop quickly as possible. There's no need for doing it in secrecy as they've done in the past. It's as much as you can test a nuclear bomb in secrecy, but they've always kept it very much under wraps as much as they could. Now it's not necessary to do so. The great deterrent is there, and now they can do things much more open now than they could previously. So given the increasing tensions in the region right now, but with regards to the United States and its rhetoric against the DPRK, it sees only this being the best time to develop as quickly as possible and to send a message at the same time.
Tell me the role, if any, you think that the United States is playing in this. Do you think with the type of basically conversation or dialogue, vocab that's being used by the U.S. president and actions taken, of course, with the United States and South Korea, we've seen a lot of war games. Has this just simply exacerbated the situation, or no, has it served as a threat to the North Koreans?
No, this has been a terrible acceleration of the problem. Basically, the U.S. is only interested in trying to disarm the DPRK so that it can possibly carry out an imperialist invasion in the future. And then the DPRK are not fools. They know very well that that's been a threat that's been hanging over their head for decades. So any attempt for them to give up their weapons would simply be opening the door for that. Now, in the past, they have temporarily halted programs in order to receive aid because of the terrible conditions they were left in as a result of sanctions and the loss of their trading partner, their primary trading partner in the Soviet Union. But now that sanctions don't seem to be causing the same kind of damage that they once did, they no longer need to do that. The United States essentially knows that it's lost on that front. Sanctions aren't going to work anymore. They haven't worked for a while, and they're not going to work in the future. The DPRK has already evolved its economy beyond the worst of what the United States is capable of doing in that regard. So anything that they're doing now, any tough talk or threats of more sanctions are really just bluster intended to aggravate the DPRK further, because they have failed to recognize that the real core of this situation has been the DPRK's right to self-defense, while it has always continually insisted that the DPRK was in the wrong and that they were the source of the aggression, when actually it was the United States.
What's the chance of war? I know you said that basically it's sort of like a bluff, because otherwise we're talking about the killing of millions of people. However, we don't necessarily have stable entities involved in this. Do you think that it could actually reach a point that a war would be declared on North Korea? Of course, we do have Russia on the Security Council and China perhaps trying to balance that out. But what about unilateral action by Washington? What's the chance of that?
Well, I think that if the U.S. really wants to, it can do it. I mean, it didn't stop them against Iraq, and such considerations didn't work in Afghanistan. If the U.S. is intent upon doing it, they're going to do it. The UN Security Council isn't going to be able to stop them. But I think that there's very little I don't think there's much of a chance of an actual war to break out, because the amount of damage, the mutually assured destruction principle that usually accompanies two sides which possess nuclear weapons, it's not a risk that they want to take. The United States could attack the DPRK, hoping that they wouldn't use some kind of retaliatory attack that would cost millions of lives, but that's a gamble that just can't be taken. The stakes are just too high in that situation. The fact is, the amount of destruction that would happen as a result of the invasion would balance out any gains that the United States would receive from having toppled the government in the DPRK. So at this time, I just don't see it as being very likely. The cost of doing so is just far too high. And that's just from the mutually assured destruction principle. That doesn't even count what kind of military operation or financial cost to a military operation against the DPRK would be. After all this time in Afghanistan, they've still yet to completely subdue the Taliban or even the general population that resents their presence. If they can't even get a country such as Afghanistan under control with tens of thousands of soldiers and well over $1 trillion, what are the chances of doing that to the DPRK? The financial cost alone would be astronomical.
And last question, how much of this do you think there are those who say that actually this is to divert attention from what is actually taking place right now inside of the United States domestically? There's a lot of division. There's a lot of a movement against the U.S. president. And we've seen in the past when there are issues inside of the country, actually Washington tries to make a situation more bold outside of the country, and especially when it comes to war, there's nothing more that they try to do to try to bring the people more together than tension or conflict or war.
Oh, definitely. It's a tremendous tactic that has worked in the past. Right after 9/11, the threats of war against Afghanistan were enough to rally, and even to a degree, before the war in Iraq was used to unify the country around imperialist expansion. I think it's probably a pretty good bet that a lot of this, since we do know that it is a bluff and bluster by the United States, says they can't really take any military action against the DPRK without having such severe consequences. It seems like much of this would be an attempt to draw attention away from domestic problems at home, most likely to distract the news media in the United States from the ongoing catastrophe that has been Hurricane Harvey. That has cost numerous lives now and is the worst hurricane that the country has suffered in decades. And there's so many things going on behind the scenes with the deep state. There's calls to have President Trump removed from office, and a lot of questions into his presidency and any connections to Russia that may or may not have existed. And this would be the perfect distraction from that. But we do see that the U.S. is very good at distracting from bigger issues by making threats of war, especially when in the past they've been against countries and governments which never really actually posed a threat to them. And with something with the DPRK, something that has, as is estimated, a 120 kiloton nuclear bomb, this is something that's very serious and something that can be portrayed as a real threat to the United States and would be a tremendous tool for distracting the American public.
Yes, indeed it would. Thank you so much for being with us out of Ontario. Mr. Jason Unruhe, political commentator and analyst.